Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis, and today we are up to the fourth quarter of 1968. There is a lot of interesting stuff going on in this quarter, even breaking it into two parts, which we're going to do. We're going to have to move fast to cover all the really interesting things that I would like to get to. So without further ado, let's begin with the top 10 albums as the quarter began. On that first chart, October 5th, 1968, the number one album in the country was The Doors' Waiting for the Sun album. At number 2 was Timepiece, the Rascals' Greatest Hits. This had been number 1 week earlier on September 28th. At number 3 was Feliciano by Jose Feliciano. It would peak at number 2 on November 2nd and return to the number 2 spot for 2 weeks in December. At number 4 was Cheap Thrills by Big Brother and the Holding Company. This would go to number 1 the next week and would stay there for 5 weeks. In the number 5 position was Are You Experienced by the Jimi Hendrix Experience. This, their first album, had been released in the US on August 23rd, 1967. It first broke into the top 10 on December 2nd, 1967. It dropped out of the top 10 4 weeks later, then re-entered the top 10 on February 24th of 68, and was in and out of the top 10 for the rest of the spring and summer, finally hitting its number 5 peak this week, October 5th, 1968, more than a year after its release. While Are You Experienced was bouncing up and down the chart, Hendrix's second album, Axis Bold as Love, had a much more traditional chart trajectory. It was released on December 1st, 1967, and had gone to number 3 for 3 weeks back on March 9th, 1968. The third album, Electric Ladyland, would be released on October 26th, just 3 weeks after Are You Experienced hit its number 5 peak. It would go to number 1 for 2 weeks, beginning November 16th. At number 6 was Glenn Campbell's 1967 release, Gentle on My Mind. It would hit number 5 the next week, October 12th. At number 7 was Realization by Johnny Rivers. It had been number 5 for 5 weeks beginning August 31st. At number 8 was Cream's Wheels of Fire. This had been number 1 for 4 weeks beginning August 10th. At number 9 was the Steppenwolf album. It had been number 6 for 3 weeks beginning September 7th. At number 10 was Iron Butterfly's Inagata Divida. This would go to number 5 for 2 weeks on August 26th, then drop back down the chart. After months on the chart, it would finally reach its peak of number 4 on August 9th, 1969. The top 10 singles on October 5th, 1968 were at number 1, Hey Jude by the Beatles, their first release on their new Apple label. It had been a long time between singles for the Beatles, and this was seen as something of a comeback after their prior single, Lady Madonna, had stalled at number 4. Where Lady Madonna might have seemed a bit perplexing and underwhelming in the spring, it could now be viewed as part of a transition to a new, more mature, post-psychedelic style for the Beatles. Hey Jude would be number 1 for a total of 9 weeks. Its B-side, Revolution, meanwhile, was in the last of its 3 weeks at its peak position of number 12. At number 2, Harper Valley PTA by Jeannie C. Riley, which had been number 1 on September 21st. It was the story of a Harper Valley widowed wife who had a teenage daughter who attended Harper Valley Junior High, and the day she socked it to the Harper Valley PTA. I think the message of this song was meant to be something about those without sin casting the first stone, but when I listen to it now, it just sounds like everybody in Harper Valley is pretty messed up, and probably none of them should have been raising kids. At number 3 was Fire by the Crazy World of Arthur Brown. It would go to number 2 on October 19th. At number 4, Little Green Apples by O.C. Smith. It would follow Fire into the number 2 position on October 26th. Girl Watcher by The Occasions was at its number 5 peak and would stay there for 4 weeks. Clarence Carter's Slip Away was at its number 6 peak. At number 7 was The Rascals' People Got to Be Free. It had been number 1 for 5 weeks beginning August 17th. The Bee Gees' I've Got to Get a Message to You was at its number 8 peak. And at number 9 was 1-2-3 Red Light by the 1910 Fruit Gum Company. It had been number 5 for 2 weeks beginning September 14th. The singles label, Buddha, was formed in 1967. Their first album release was Captain Beefheart's Safe as Milk. Buddha Records was having a great year in 1968 with their selection of bubblegum hits. In addition to 1-2-3 Red Light, there had been Green Tambourine by the Lemon Pipers, a number 1 hit, Simon Says by the 1910 Fruit Gum Company, which had gone to number 4, and Yummy 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 by the Ohio Express, which had also gone to number 4. In November 68, Chewy Chewy by the Ohio Express would go to number 15, and a late 68 release, The Worst That Could Happen by the Brooklyn Bridge, would go to number 3 early in 1969. It was written by Jim Webb and produced by the very busy Wes Farrell, who in a few years would be producer on the Partridge Family's records. Though it wouldn't last, they had found a successful niche as almost the Disney of record labels, making music for kids in the increasingly adult pop singles market. Getting back to the top 10, in the number 10 spot was I Say a Little Prayer by Aretha Franklin. It had been released as a double A-side with The House That Jack Built, which had reached number 6 on September 7th. Dionne Warwick's version of I Say a Little Prayer had gone to number 4 late in 67. This was at its number 10 peak. Singles that would come and go in the fourth quarter included My Special Angel by the Vogues, which would go to number 7 for 2 weeks beginning October 12th. Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud by James Brown and His Famous Flames would go to number 10 on October 19th. Over You by Gary Puckett and the Union Gap would go to number 7 for 2 weeks beginning October 26th. Produced by Paul McCartney and on the Apple label, Mary Hopkins' Those Were the Days would go to number 2 for 3 weeks beginning November 2nd. The Grassroots' Midnight Confessions would hit number 5 on November 2nd. Eleanor by the Turtles would hit number 6 on November 2nd. Hold Me Tight by Johnny Nash would hit number 5 for 2 weeks beginning November 9th. And White Room by Cream, now just billed as Cream rather than The Cream, would go to number 6 for 3 weeks beginning November 9th. Steppenwolf followed their number 2 hit Born to Be Wild strongly with Magic Carpet Ride, which would go to number 3 on November 30th. And Both Sides Now by Judy Collins, her first big hit, would peak at number 8 on December 21st. Big new album releases in October included The Second by Steppenwolf on October 1st. On October 12th, we got Aretha in Paris, which would go to number 13 for the first 2 weeks of 1969. And, as mentioned earlier, Electric Ladyland by the Jimi Hendrix Experience, containing their first and, as it turned out, only top 40 hit single, a cover of All Along the Watchtower from Bob Dylan's recent John Wesley Harding album. The single would go to number 20. In November, we got Glenn Campbell's Wichita Lineman album, Sergio Mendes and Brazil 66 Fool on the Hill album, featuring the late summer hit title track, which peaked at number 6 on September 28th, and Scarborough Fair, which would go to number 16 on December 14th. The album would reach number 3 on January 11th, 1969. On November 8th came the release of Diana Ross and the Supremes' Join the Temptations in advance of their TCB television special, which would air on December 9th. It would go to number 2 on January 11th, 1969. On December 2nd, we got the soundtrack to the TCB television special. This did even better for the Supremes and the Temptations, hitting number 1 on February 8th, 1969. Both groups had recently released singles that represented departures for them and for Motown music. Diana Ross and the Supremes' Love Child single was a socially conscious song with a more modern rock arrangement than earlier Supremes hits. The Love Child single would go to number 1 for 2 weeks beginning November 30th. Its parent album, also released in November, would go to number 14 for 2 weeks beginning January 25th, 1969. Arguably, an even more radical departure for a Motown act was Cloud 9 by the Temptations, with socially conscious lyrics and a hard-rocking psychedelic soul arrangement courtesy of producer Norman Whitfield, and seemingly influenced by Sly and the Family Stone's hit Dance to the Music earlier in the year. Cloud 9 would hit number 6 for the first 2 weeks of January 69. Its parent album wouldn't be released until early 1969 when it would go to number 4. Meanwhile, in December 68, we got the Temptations live at the Copa, which would go to number 15 on March 1st, 1969. Released on November 22nd was the long-awaited new Beatles album, a double album featuring many of the songs they'd written in India earlier in the year. In absolute contrast to the lavish sleeves of Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour, this one came in a plain white cover and was titled simply The Beatles. Also released that day was the soundtrack to Elvis's upcoming special, Elvis. This was his first top 10 album since Harem Scarum 3 years earlier. It would go to number 8 for 3 weeks beginning February 8, 1969. Released on December 6th was the Rolling Stones' Beggar's Banquet. The release of this had been delayed while the band and its record label fought over proposed album cover artwork. The Stones ultimately lost the fight for the album cover they wanted, and when it finally came out, it was in a nearly plain white sleeve that once again drew comments that they were just following what the Beatles were doing. The music was another matter. Along with the earlier single Jumpin' Jack Flash, it represented not just a return to form after the general misstep of their Satanic Majesty's request, but possibly their finest work so far. As it transpired, the single and album ushered in the Rolling Stones' Imperial phase. Strangely, this wouldn't chart quite as highly as the number 2 their Satanic Majesty's request had. This would go to number 5 for 3 weeks beginning November 11th. Late 1968 albums making more of an impact on the charts in 1969 included Gentle on My Mind by Dean Martin, Soulful Strut by Young Holt Unlimited, the Blood, Sweat, and Tears album, Tom Jones' first U.S. album, Help Yourself, and Crimson and Clover by Tommy James and the Shondells. The fourth quarter of the year is usually a busy time for new movie releases, and 1968 was no exception. Released on October 7th was I Love You, Alice B Toklas, starring Peter Sellers as square attorney Harry Fine, who embraces hippie culture after unknowingly eating a marijuana brownie. It was the kind of trippy, colorful, nonsensical movie, usually starring Peter Sellers, that you could only get in the late 60s. On October 8th, we got Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet. Released a day later on the 9th, Finian's Rainbow, a musical fantasy starring Fred Astaire and Petula Clark. One day later on the 10th, we got Barbarella, a psychedelic science fiction comedy movie for adults only, starring Jane Fonda in the title role. It would be number 1 for the first 2 weeks of its release. On the 16th of October came The Boston Strangler, starring Tony Curtis and loosely based on the true story of the 13 murders committed by the real Boston Strangler in the early 60s. On October 17th came Bullet, a Steve McQueen action thriller. It would be number 1 for 2 weeks in January. On the 23rd, Live a Little, Love a Little, Elvis's third and final movie release of the year. And on October 30th, The Lion in Winter. Katharine Hepburn would win an Academy Award for Best Actress for this, in a tie with Barbra Streisand for her performance in Funny Girl. On November 1st, the Motion Picture Association of America introduced a new rating system for movies in the U.S. As originally adopted, the ratings were G, suggested for general audiences, M, suggested for mature audiences, parental discretion advised, R, restricted, persons under 16 not admitted without a parent or adult guardian, or X, persons under 16 not admitted. The first film ever to receive an X rating was the French-British co-production Girl on a Motorcycle, starring Marianne Faithfull and Alain Delon. Rather than release it that way, Warner's recut it to get an R rating and released it as Naked Under Leather late in November. Of course, in 1968, an X or even an R was assigned to much tamer stuff than it soon would be. We'll leave it there for now. We still need to talk about the new movie releases of November and December, about television, some more about music, a little bit about the news, and not forgetting our friends the Beach Boys. Thank you for watching. Please join me next time when we will finally wrap up the year of 1968. I look forward to your comments. Please like and subscribe. I always appreciate that. And we will see you next week. Thanks. Bye.